All right, this is the bonus content for Volume 4, Issue 3 of Science of Rowing. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to sit down with a researcher, Kristin Haraldsdottir, who has done some original research with female collegiate rowers in the United States. But first, let's have Kristin just introduce herself and tell us a little bit about her background and her research interests.
Yeah, hey, Joe, it's really nice to be on. Nice to talk about this topic that I'm actually very passionate about. It's one of my, I was telling you earlier, it's one of my favorite manuscripts that I've put together. I'm Kristin Haraldsdottir. I was I'll try to keep this brief, but my interest in rowing goes back to my own career as a rower at Princeton, where I was in a very special 8 in 2006 that had, I can't even remember, probably, I think 5 Olympians in that boat when we won NCAAs. And then I went on to coach at Princeton till 2012 and went to grad school with every intention of going back to coaching, but really just wanted to get a couple of years under my belt learning about physiology, especially women's physiology, and athlete physiology, and really just get a better grip on the implications of training, both mentally and physically, for long-term outcomes in athletes. And it quickly turned into a 6-year master's and PhD situation, where I studied both athletes, general population, and disease population, which is really what you end up doing so often in exercise physiology, because you use exercise as a physiological stressor to understand how the body responds. And so I got really interested just in the wide range. And in the, I guess, almost 11 years since I've been in academia, I've really it's interesting to think about where, when you think about elite athletics, elite sports, elite athletes, it's really this, it's an exciting topic. You quickly get into really interesting and fun, but really narrow conversations. But really, I'm really pleased with this paper that we're discussing, the contribution of lean mass distribution on aerobic fitness and performance in NCAA Division I female rowers, because this really does, it takes a holistic view at the whole body and contributions to performance. And I do think that the findings that we'll get into really speak to, I think, my interests, where you are taking a macro approach to performance and dividing it into the sum of its parts to actually really get a good idea of what's going on, what matters, and what to pay attention to so that you don't lose sight of holistic training. Anyway, went off on a little bit of a tangent there, but really it's just to say that I got into this academic and research world because I was interested in something very specific, which was to go back into coaching and be really good at it. And really what it turned into is a career chasing down questions on how to improve both physical and mental outcomes in athletes while keeping an eye on performance. And I can get into a little bit more what we're focusing on now, just really briefly. So I still hold a position as a scientist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in Dr. Andrew Watson's lab. It's a human performance lab, but we're also in the Badger Athletic Performance Group, where Dr. Watson is a physician for the Badger athletes, which is a Big Ten school. So just hundreds of just phenomenal athletes that undergo preseason and postseason fitness testing. And we just have this great relationship with them where we have access to this data over the years, over several years at this point. And we're also able to capture a lot of objective data like VO2 max, Tmax, ventilatory threshold, heart rate recovery, heart rate variability, that sort of thing, but also subjective data where we start to collect well, I guess it's not all of it's subjective, but starting to look at sleep, mood, stress level, things like that. And starting to really take a deeper dive into some of these questions. And what's really exciting is we also have DEXA scan data. And now I think I'm getting a little too specific on the article, but really what this is like, what we're starting to, so we get a lot of objective, we do a lot of objective deep dives into elite athlete performance and implications of training and things like that. But we're also starting to, as a group, think about on the kind of mental health side of things, and especially during COVID, this was a huge emphasis for us because it was really the best we could do because we weren't able to do as many in-person testing sessions. It was understanding the mental health implications of sport participation, loss of sport participation, which is actually so relevant when it comes to time loss injuries. So injuries that result in time loss away from sport, even if they don't, the mental health implications of being injured while trying to play. And so we're looking at now interventions that can actually help athletes both mentally and physically in response or following injury, illness, or just in general. So thinking now about mindfulness interventions and how to implement those with the Badger athletes. We actually are working with a mindfulness expert who's actually on staff at UW. His name's Chad McGahee, but that's kind of like, just to give you an idea, like this arc and where this paper will fit into that is really from elite high performance that's really fine-tuned all the way out to mindfulness interventions to improve mental health outcomes in athletes. So this, yeah, I'll let you stop me. I need to stop myself.
That was great. No, that's really cool. I'd like to see the trajectory of where you're headed with your research and where things are going. And it's also, I have to imagine that as we continue to move out of the pandemic, we're able to do more and more work and research in person again now, as that was really kind of constrained during that 2-year period. There's a real need. There's a real need for the things that you mentioned, better understanding, mindfulness interventions with athletes. And so those are going to be resources as you get that research published and stuff and it comes out. I think they're going to be fantastic resources for athletes to have in the future.
I think it's huge. I think there's like this greater awareness now. It's not only an awareness, but there is a greater awareness among athletes and coaches and support staff about just this big picture, like without good mental health, there can't be high performance. There will come a time, they're in this positive feedback loop, where if you jump out of the positive feedback loop, it can quickly spin in the wrong direction. And I think we're seeing that now. It's really exciting to be back in person and actually interacting with athletes and hearing once they hear that we're working on all these other things that are not just obviously performance related. They're so excited. They're so eager. So it's a really cool thing to be back in person and starting to, because we all went through a lot the last 3 years. And I think there's this great awareness that we can do and feel better.
Awesome. So let's turn to this original research that you did. This was published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research through the NSCA. And so you looked at the lean mass distribution of Division I female collegiate rowers. And so I guess the first part that I wanted to start with is how did you arrive or what made you want to pursue this particular research question?
So this was a slow burn for me, because this is really why I went to grad school. Is like I wanted to answer questions like this, and I was very eager. I had no idea how slow academia actually was when I started. I thought I could just go right to the cool, fun research that answered my immediate question. But this was really 10 years in the making, where we actually had. So taking it back to my athlete and coaching days, you start off your practice and there's maybe like 2 minutes spent on core. Everyone's kind of, maybe not putting their all into it, maybe like 20%, you're like doing your bird dogs and you're like bicycle kicks and whatever. And then you go put hands on the boat and get out there. And then sure, in your in your lifting routines, there's a little bit of core, but you're thinking mostly about the legs, and there's really like, I really wanted to understand, 13, 12 years ago, what mattered the most, right? Like what was it that actually like would not only get a boat to cross the finish line first, but do it while being injury free, and do it while also being able to do it across different distances, right? You're thinking about fall season, spring season, not to mention national team, like world level stuff. So thinking about 1,500 meters, 2,000 meters, 6,000 meters. And it was, the DEXA scans are actually taken pre and post season on athletes, kind of for health reasons. Like it's a way to, if you don't know what a DEXA scan does, it basically, the athlete lies flat. It's kind of like an MRI, if you can picture that, although there's no tube in this one, so it's not as like claustrophobia inducing. But basically this scanner, very high tech, goes across your body, doesn't touch it, and is able to divide the regions of your body, so legs, trunk, arms, head and neck, into bone, lean, and fat mass. So it's able to kind of break those three apart. And often DEXA scans actually in the real world setting, not the fitness or elite athlete setting, is used a lot for bone density and things like that. But we as exercise physiologists were really interested in this lean mass, which is, if you take away your bone mass and your fat mass, what's left is lean, and that's generally your lean muscle mass, right? In the trunk, it gets a little bit more complicated because you've got your major organs in there, but it's really, you can think of it as your lean muscle mass. And so the question that I had over these, first 10 years of my, I guess, academic training was really understanding, when it comes to rowing, we know, those of us who have been in it for a long time, or maybe the ones who are smarter than me know it right away, it's not just legs, it's not legs and arms. The thing that actually connects those two and is, the thing that can buckle, the thing that really breaks down when you're when exhaustion and fatigue hits, think third 500, what is it that makes or breaks a race? It's, can you stay connected, right? It's that core. And so I really started to chase down this, think of ways where we could actually test this. How much do the legs versus the core, and core meaning not just, not just the abs, right? Like the whole thing, your erector spinatus, you've got your, just all of the musculature from your shoulders to your hips, versus the arms. So those three, because they're really at least the way, we've got this rowing, as we all know, and there's a rowing podcast and publication, is a whole body exercise across multiple joints, right? You've got all these compound movements, and thinking about, I think the core, I think we intuitively know that the core is really important. There are a lot of back injuries in rowing. There are a lot of, intercostal muscles, things going on. And so we know that it's a piece of the puzzle that's incredibly important and really devastating when something happens to it. And so the question really was what matters the most, which of these regions affects performance and endurance, was really kind of the question I was able to ask with the data I had at hand. So we had all this data on pre and post season fitness testing, which is in the rowing athletes, we have them do it on a Concept 2 erg. So they're in the boathouse, and we've got a metabolic cart that goes right to the boathouse, and the athletes perform incremental maximal exercise testing on the erg, right? And it's written in the article, but it starts their 3-minute stages. It's if you've ever done a Bruce VO2 max test, it's a stepwise test. 3-minute stages was how we did it. Start at a given wattage, increase by set wattage. And the athletes were allowed to go between 22 and 28 strokes per minute. They could, it's by wattage, not by split. And they take it to max. There's criteria for the maximal test. I don't have to get into that, but there is. And so we had this data. So we had VO2 max data, and we have maximal time to exhaustion. So your VO2 max isn't always the value at the end of the test. I won't get into that, but we used time to exhaustion as our indicator of endurance. If I were to, continue exploring this line of questioning, I would do it slightly differently in the future. We can talk about that if you want to. And then we had fitness or aerobic fitness as that VO2 max, which we got from the metabolic cart, which is basically, looking at how much oxygen the athlete is consuming, their maximal capacity for consuming oxygen, I should say. And you look at that 2 ways. You can look at that absolutely, which is just liters per minute, which doesn't account for their body size or body weight. Or you can look at it adjusting for weight, which is generally the way we do it, although it is a little bit interesting in a sport like rowing, where it is not, you're not having to hold up your own weight like in running. We can get into that too. That's a long conversation as well. So basically what we did, it was pretty straightforward. And this is, I haven't seen this work done elsewhere. So I was excited to just contribute to the literature and kind of take a first stab at how do we try to figure out the relative contributions to performance and fitness, performance broken down into, I should say, fitness and endurance in female athletes, rowing athletes. And so really straightforward question, just looking at those 3 regions of lean mass, legs, trunk or core, and arms, and comparing that to statistically to VO2 max and maximal time to exhaustion, or Tmax. And that's really, that's a long-winded way of saying I had a really basic question a long time ago, understanding, could we quantify how relatively important each one of those regions was to fitness and endurance in rowers? And I think we did a good job presenting kind of a first look at the fact that, I don't know if you want me to get into the findings now. I guess anyone who's listening to this probably read the article and probably the original article and your article. I think it's obvious to anyone who's been in rowing. It's a really satisfying finding, at least for me it was. It's really satisfying because we found the strongest correlation to VO2 max was the lean mass in the legs. So that's where your power is. That's where, it's great that like a lot of traditional rowing training has been in, squats and leg press. But the time to exhaustion had the strongest statistical relationship to lean mass in the trunk. So this is intuitively really interesting. And to me, and I think anyone who spends a lot of time in the rowing world, we know the importance of the core. And it's an interesting thing to talk to people not from the rowing world because about this finding, because it doesn't seem, I think, at the surface all that important. But when you start thinking about, anecdotally, all the athletes that that have suffered injuries, or those, everyone knows those athletes who spend an hour on their core work every day, and they're unstoppable. They look like they're shaped kind of like barrels, and they just go up, they're just unstoppable. They don't get injured as much. They just are beasts on the erg. They're in the first 8. They're just, so it's like, it's this you know, that's not something that I wrote about in the article, and I wouldn't, because I think it's, well, I wouldn't, at least in this first one. But I think it's intuitively a finding that is very satisfying to folks that have spent time as rowers or as coaches kind of observing this. And I think it's something that I look forward to building on, because it's this is the kind of stuff that I think really can be helpful, because I think back to my early rowing days when we would, you know, spend those like 2 minutes on bicycle kicks. I'm very lucky personally, not that this is about me, but I didn't really suffer many injuries, but I knew a lot of people that did. And I think that this is hopefully a way to at least, you know, provide some solid evidence that the core deserves a ton of attention.
That was fantastic. I was so pleased to read this original research article you did, because I think that you really broke some new ground. And from a performance standpoint, we know, you know, there's tons of studies that look at the overall lean mass of a rower, whether it's male or female, or you know, different age groups or different competitive categories. And there's a strong relationship, but you took it another layer, another step further. And it's like, okay, let's look at the specific distribution across the body, and how does that actually really factor into performance? And so, as you said, it's very intuitive, like, okay, the legs are going to contribute more to VO2. The trunk is going to contribute a higher percentage towards time to exhaustion. And so I've been spending a lot of time reading literature in and around rowing related low back pain and low back injury in rowing. And some of the things that we know definitively that are causing low back pain. So one is either, you know, high training volume or high training intensity. As the athlete undergoes fatigue, there's changes in lumbopelvic position. So they go from a neutral or slightly anterior pelvic position with a flat low back to a posterior pelvic tilt. And, you know, so out of this article, we now know that having requisite lean mass at the trunk is important for time to exhaustion. And so now I'm thinking, okay, we've got this finding. How do we take this, and how do we better train the trunk? How do we add lean mass to the trunk and to improve that? So this was, to me, this was great. I think this is lines up with a lot of the things in and around injury as you touched on. And so I guess my first question, after you just discussed some of the findings, is what's the next step for research building off of your work? How do we increase and really target specifically improving lean tissue mass at the trunk for a rower? That's 1A. And then 1B is, what do we need to, where will we do that? Will we do that in an S&C sense, or is that taking place on the erg or in the rowing shell? Where would you look to start? And, you know, what are your thoughts around interventions or practical applications?
Well, my first disclaimer is that I always trust the athletic training staff and the physical therapy staff and the strength and conditioning staff a lot more than I would trust myself. And so that's my disclaimer there. I am not any of those professions. So that's, I think, really important to, I'm very humble about that. But I would say that I've spent a long enough time in academia to be boring, and to say that this is like a lot, this as satisfying as this is to me, to have this start, it just begs more questions. So in order to answer the questions that you just posed, which are very good and exactly where our heads should be, I think the next step is, and in fact, I could do this and I should, is to look at these same data and look at injury incidents and types of injury, and start to understand, you know, is there a correlation, I actually, since these data were collected, we have quite a bit more since then. And actually looking at what is the, I think based on this, that this is a great argument for injury prevention, because of the fact that so many rowing injuries are in the trunk. But as a responsible scientist, my next step is now not to say that this is related to injury. Let's check if it is. And I can do that. We have that data. So that would be, I think, step number one. And you asked in your first question, especially in the low back, in the lumbar region, we can, DEXA scans are incredible. It's actually possible to zero in on smaller chunks of the body, and so that's that's a question you can actually pose and start to chase that down objectively with DEXA data. But you could also, with people more skilled than I in actually looking at low back strength or back strength, mobility, actually start to quantify the or quantify and correlate, the lean mass in the trunk with strength, with actual functional outcomes, and start to understand that way from more of a physical therapy perspective, like the actual implications of this and how to train it. How to train that, how to actually build strength in the trunk that does prevent injury. Because I think, just to cover myself a little bit and make sure like I'm really clear, this finding was that, and the one I get so excited about from a performance perspective is, anecdotally, as an athlete, as a coach, the thing I'm most excited about in rowing is the ability to outlast everyone else. That's the thing that, like, I think it's what sets rowers apart. We're all a little bit, you're able to push through things that most people can't. You can't do that if you're, well, it's some people do, but it's not great pushing through immense amounts of pain. And so I think what's exciting about this is that the trunk, the lean mass in the trunk, has something to do with that longevity, that max time to maximal exhaustion. I can't remember what your second question was, but I'm going to make my one more and just remind, if I didn't address it, remind me what it was. But I think where I would take this, and maybe this was your question, where I would take this next is that so that time to exhaustion in a stepwise test like this is not really, that's not real world for rowing. That is, that's not something that you see out on a race course. That's not something you see in it. That's not really like, you're not taking yourself through 70 watts, 100 watts, 130, 160 for 3 minutes. What I'd like to see is more of a study similar to what we did, but where you've got the athletes undergoing something that they do for their training, for their competition, something that's more real world, something like you'd see in cycling. You'd see a time trial. You see a lot of research like Michael Joyner at Mayo doing cycling time trials in his research, which is super interesting. That's another rabbit hole that's not super relevant, but actually, shifting from this VO2 max testing to actually something that's more relevant to the athlete, to the coach. So to sum that up, I think what to do next to build strength, I think I would have more research to do before really confidently answering that, which is like the biggest cop out that researchers are allowed to do. And then shifting to testing that looks more like what athletes are used to seeing in their training, and what really what they're really going to experience when they're on the starting line.
I mean, that makes perfect sense, right? So, we're just, like I said, you broke new ground with this research. We're not at a point where we could make really good practical application recommendations, but that next step, I hadn't even thought of that until this interview. So moving into on water environment where maybe they're doing, maybe it's during a training session or maybe it's during an actual race where you're collecting data across a 2K or something. And so it's similar in the regard that the athlete is going to be doing a maximal effort type of intensity, but it's not going to be a graded incremental step test.
That's right.
Yeah, so that would be really cool. That's going to present its own challenges because you know better than most how difficult it would be to at least get a good setup in the rowing shell where you're able to collect, especially in the US collegiate system. The boat we look at the most is the 8, right? So ideally you have 8 athletes with some type of hardware, software setup where you're collecting data across a 2K all simultaneously. But yeah, so now I'm thinking, what's the equipment that would allow us to do that?
Cosmed makes it. So Cosmed is we didn't use Cosmed in this study, but Cosmed is a company based out of the Midwest, I think somewhere. They're great. They make a portable metabolic system. It's basically a little backpack. And so it is possible. So if anyone's out there and thinking about this, it's like, it is possible. I think you can start on the ergo, like I think that would be where I would go next. There's so many variables on the water that could confound the findings. There's so much technique. There's so much like wind, water, like you could ask, I think, that down the line, that's definitely where I would go. But I think the next, thinking about even a 20-minute test or a, like almost like an FTP, starting to think about ways to develop this sort of testing, standardized testing in rowing, where you can start to chase down answers to these questions because they have so many far-reaching applications for rowers' longevity, and especially when you start thinking about the implications of this on injury, on not just rowers' longevity, but their long-term mental health outcomes and their ability to continue to participate in the sport that they love.
So the last question I have for you is, we touched on everything that I wanted to cover. This is great.
Oh, good.
Thank you. So where would you like to see research overall go with rowing, and in particular female rowers, regardless of competitive level or age or anything of that? Like, where do you think are some areas or questions that we need to start to address and explore?
I think I appreciate the question because I think it's so important. We were talking about this a little bit before we got started. Is I think one of the things that I care very deeply about in my own research is that women are overrepresented in what I do. And I'd like to see just more women, like research on female athletes in general. And so more is my first answer. More. I think that's female athletes are historically underrepresented. That's, I think, pretty widely known at this point. But what's really interesting about female athletes is I think there's two things. There's a biological component that is not well understood and has been overlooked because it is, and I'm using quotes if you're just listening, difficult to account for hormonal contributions, whether that is monthly menstrual cycle. So you've got this daily, the hormonal profile of a female athlete is changing because of progesterone and estrogen. You've got pregnancy and what happens during pregnancy, after pregnancy. You've got menopause, thinking about our masters athletes and thinking about what changes there. So you've got the biological component of women that I have not seen it in women's rowing research. And then you've got the psychosocial side where female athletes are living in a different world than male athletes. And that is going to bleed into the way they nourish their bodies. And that's going to affect their body composition. You've got psychosocial differences in societal expectations, in social groups, in the way that team dynamics can alter training intensity and otherwise, lots of things. So I think that, and far be it for me to really truly understand
Can you still hear me, Kristin? You froze a little bit there. Hey, you
sorry about
froze.
that. I kept talking. What was the last thing you heard? Because I get going on this topic.
No, it's okay. The last thing you had said before it cut off was you were just talking about, you talked about the three kind of biological areas, and then you were getting into the psychosocial.
Oh, okay. So I'll just start on psychosocial. So you've got all those biological differences, and I didn't even, mention all of them because I think there are so many things that those hormonal, especially differences, bleed into, like sleep, heart rate variability, stress. Like it's kind of, blood pressure, resting heart rate. Like there's so much that is there's a cascade there on the biological side. Then you've got the psychosocial side. And societal differences that female athletes are facing. I don't mean just negative, it's just different. And that can be team dynamics, that can be pressures to look a certain way, changes your nutrition, changes your body composition, changes how you sleep, changes, you've got team dynamics that are different on the women's versus men's side. Sometimes it's not to get too far into that, but I think that we have so much work to do, so much work to do to understand what athletes are facing. And I think for me, I'm particularly interested in the women's side and understanding these physical and psychosocial or social effects of, gender in sport and sex in sport. So it's like that was just like 10 things maybe like that I can think of just like off the top of my head, that every single one is going to change how you show up to practice. Let's say, just thinking back to the hormonal side, the biological side for women, if just to get, nitty gritty, like slightly, in the ovulation phase of the hormonal cycle, you've got this surge in two hormones where right at the beginning of the cycle, they're very low. And in the surge, the female athlete's sleeping better, heart rate variability is higher, resting heart rate is lower. But in the beginning of the cycle, that's all flipped. So what do we know about that? Just about nothing. And so it's like, it's really interesting. And it's exciting to think how much work we have to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have a ton of work to do. Kristin, this
Yeah.
was wonderful. Thank you so much. It was
Yeah,
really
thank
great.
you.
My pleasure. It was really great to catch up with you. And I'm just excited to get your work out there a little bit more. And as I said, I thought you broke new ground with this research. So hopefully, the podcast and the interview we're doing and my review of your article just gets it out there a little bit more. And this is something rowers and coaches are going to take a little bit closer look at. And hopefully this is something that informs their coaching or training practice better.
I really appreciate it, Joe. I really do. I'm excited for folks to take a look at this, and I'm curious to hear what people think.
Cool.
I really appreciate you shining a light on it.
Yeah, my pleasure.